Tonight, we step into a forbidden corner of Christian history, where the names of demons were not born in hellfire, but written in ink. Names whispered in exorcisms, feared from pulpits, and taught as ancient enemies of God. But what if those names did not begin as demons at all? What if they were once gods, angels, or sacred intelligences, erased and rewritten by those who controlled Scripture? Deep inside the Vatican's memory of the past lies the record of how certain names were chosen, altered, and condemned, not by divine revelation, but by councils, translations, and quiet decisions made behind closed doors. These names did not fall from the sky. They were inherited, transformed, and weaponized as Christianity rose and rival beliefs were buried. Those who questioned their origins found themselves silenced by doctrine, tradition, and time itself. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because once you learn where these names really came from, you may never hear them the same way again. A book said to hold the secrets of gods, written not in gold, but in ink, in a language most have never heard of, not Greek, not Latin, but something older, hidden in temple walls and forgotten scrolls. This was not just myth, it was real, and its name was the Book of Thoth. For centuries, stories have circulated about a mysterious text said to grant ultimate knowledge, the power to speak to animals, control the heavens, or even become like the gods. But long before these stories became legend, there was a place, a system, and a language. In ancient Egypt, under Greek and Roman rule, there existed a network of temple libraries and scribe schools known collectively as the House of Life. These were not public institutions. They were elite centers of knowledge, deeply sacred, often attached to temples like those at Edfu and Hermopolis. It was here that scribes trained for years to master both writing and ritual, and it was here that a very real text began to take shape. Modern scholars now call it the Demotic Book of Thoth. Demotic was a later stage of the Egyptian language, used for everyday writing by the time of the Ptolemies. But this book was not everyday. It was written in a way that combined teaching, myth, and priestly discourse. It was never meant for ordinary eyes. The text survives only in scattered papyri, now housed in collections around the world. Pieces of it were found in the Berlin Papyrus, the Carlsberg collection, and the famous Tebtunis Temple Library in modern-day Egypt. These fragments, dated roughly between the 3rd century before Christ and the 2nd century after, show that the Book of Thoth was not a single volume, but a series of writings. What connects them is the figure at the center, Thoth. In Egyptian tradition, Thoth was the god of writing, wisdom, and divine measurement. He was often depicted as an ibis-headed being, or sometimes a baboon, holding a scribal palette. But in these texts, he is more than a myth. He is a teacher, and his student, often called the one who loves knowledge, asks him questions about writing, about the soul, about the nature of the divine. Their dialogue reads like a sacred exam, full of riddles, metaphors, and ritual secrets. This is not a book of magic spells. It is a book about what it means to know. And to become a scribe was to take part in that sacred journey. In this context, the Book of Thoth becomes something deeper. Not a tool of control, but a rite of passage. Its power did not come from one page or one phrase, but from how it was transmitted, hand to hand, voice to voice, scroll to scroll. It was fragile, secret, and alive, and that is why so little of it survived. Because the knowledge it carried was meant only for those initiated into the mysteries of ink, silence, and time. Not all books are meant to be read. Some are meant to be remembered, and others, like the Book of Thoth, are meant to be found again. When the Greeks arrived in Egypt after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century before Christ, they did more than build cities. They brought their gods. But what happened in Egypt was unlike anything they expected. Instead of replacing local beliefs, something else took place. A fusion, a merging of minds. And at the center of that collision stood one figure who came to represent both worlds. Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing, wisdom, and time, slowly became identified with Hermes, the Greek messenger of the gods. But this was not just a name swap. It was a full transformation that would shape centuries of spiritual philosophy. In Egypt, Thoth had long been seen as the divine scribe, the inventor of hieroglyphs, the one who measured the stars and recorded the will of the gods. He was central to the judgment of the soul and believed to have authored books of powerful knowledge. In Greek tradition, Hermes was a god of boundaries, messages, and cleverness. He guided souls to the underworld, brought messages from Olympus, and was associated with speech, trickery, and even the invention of writing. When Greeks living in Egypt, especially in cities like Alexandria and Hermopolis, encountered Thoth, they saw in him something familiar. But they also saw something deeper. Thoth was not just a guide. He was a master of secret knowledge, and so they called him Hermes. But not just any Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus, meaning Hermes the thrice great. The exact reason for this title is still debated. Some say it referred to his mastery of the 3 worlds, physical, mental, and spiritual. Others say it honored him as the greatest priest, the greatest philosopher, and the greatest king. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. A new figure was born. Not purely Egyptian, not purely Greek, but something else. A symbol of ancient wisdom that seemed to transcend both cultures. This merging, called syncretism, became a core feature of the Ptolemaic period. It allowed Greek settlers to adopt and respect Egyptian beliefs while maintaining their own philosophical systems. And Hermes Trismegistus became the ultimate authority for a new kind of knowledge. A knowledge that was both divine and human, mystical and rational. This figure would later be credited with writing the Hermetica, a set of Greek philosophical texts filled with dialogues about the cosmos, the soul, and the search for truth. But the seed of that tradition began here, in the temples of Egypt, where Greek and Egyptian priests looked at the same stars, read from similar scrolls, and saw in each other reflections of the same divine truth. When Thoth became Hermes, it was not just about merging 2 gods. It was about creating a bridge between languages, between faiths, between worlds. And that bridge still stands today, buried beneath layers of time, waiting to be crossed by anyone who dares to ask how much truth can be found in the space between civilizations. In the centuries after Egypt came under Greek and Roman rule, a new wave of writings began to appear. They were written in Greek, but they carried the spirit of something older, something Egyptian. Attributed to a legendary teacher named Hermes Trismegistus, these texts formed what we now call the Hermetica. And for a time, they were considered some of the most important writings in the ancient world. The Hermetic writings did not appear all at once. Most scholars agree they were written between the 1st and 3rd centuries after Christ, during the Roman Empire. But their ideas reach further back. These were not dry philosophical treatises. they were written as dialogues, usually between Hermes and a student, discussing the nature of the universe, the human soul, and the path to divine knowledge. What made them unique was how they combined Greek philosophy with Egyptian spiritual ideas. In these texts you find concepts from Plato and the Stoics, blended with the idea that true wisdom is a kind of inner awakening. The Hermetica taught that the material world is not the final reality, that the soul is divine, and that through deep knowledge and spiritual discipline, humans can return to their true nature. Some texts are cosmic, describing how the universe was created by a single source, known as the One or the All. Others focus on ethics, the importance of humility, and the dangers of ignorance. But always there is a sense that this wisdom is sacred, secret, and powerful. These writings weren't meant for the masses. They were for those ready to think deeply, to question the nature of life, and to seek knowledge not through faith alone, but through understanding. The most famous collection is the Corpus Hermeticum, a set of 17 main treatises preserved in medieval manuscripts. Another important text is the Asclepius, which survives in Latin and includes ideas about medicine, divine healing, and the soul. The influence of the Hermetica spread through the Roman world and beyond. Early Christian thinkers debated whether the writings were heretical or useful. Some saw Hermes Trismegistus as a wise pagan who somehow glimpsed divine truth before Christ. Others viewed the texts as dangerous and misleading. But despite this tension, the Hermetic stream kept flowing. It moved through Alexandria, where Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian scholars lived side by side. It was preserved by philosophers, mystics, and copyists. And centuries later, it would be rediscovered by Renaissance scholars who believed they had found the purest voice of ancient wisdom. What began as a series of spiritual dialogues in late antique Egypt would go on to shape alchemy, astrology, philosophy, and even modern science. The Hermetica were not just books. They were keys, and those who read them believed they were unlocking the very structure of reality. Even today, their influence is felt in unexpected places, not because they promise magic, but because they ask questions no one else dared to ask. Questions about who we are, where we come from, and what it means to know the divine. When people hear the name Book of Thoth, they often imagine a single ancient volume filled with cosmic secrets and magical spells. But the truth is more complex. What survives today is not one book, but two different traditions. One is Egyptian, written in a language called Demotic. The other is Greek, known as Hermetic philosophy, and each has taken a very different path through history. The Egyptian Book of Thoth survives only in fragments. These pieces were written between the 3rd century before Christ and the 2nd century after. They come from temple libraries and scribe schools, mostly in places like Tebtunis and Edfu. The texts are written on papyrus, in a script used for religious and scholarly purposes. Today, many of these papyri are stored in museums and universities around the world. Some are in Berlin, others in Copenhagen or Oxford. They were discovered in the early 20th century and studied much later. The content is challenging. It is written as a dialogue between a master, often linked to Thoth, and a student who seeks sacred knowledge. The focus is on the art of writing, the role of the scribe, and the connection between knowledge and the divine. This version of the Book of Thoth is deeply tied to Egyptian temple culture. It was never meant for mass reading. It was part of a priestly system, taught through ritual, memorization, and spiritual practice. It faded as temple life declined, and what remained was buried, damaged, or forgotten. The Hermetic tradition, by contrast, had a different survival story. It was written in Greek, not Egyptian. Most of it comes from a later period, starting in the 1st century after Christ. The texts known as the Hermetica were copied by hand, preserved by philosophers, and translated into Latin during the Renaissance. The most famous of these texts is the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of spiritual writings attributed to Hermes, Trismegistus. These were not temple documents. They were philosophical dialogues, blending Greek and Egyptian ideas into a vision of the universe as alive, intelligent, and filled with divine meaning. While the Egyptian Book of Thoth was preserved in bits of papyrus and forgotten libraries, Hermetic writings were passed down through monastic scriptoria, private collections, and later printed books. The Hermetica were read by Christian thinkers, Renaissance scholars, and later occultists. They shaped Western ideas about magic, alchemy, and science. So today, when people speak of Thoth or Hermetic wisdom, they are usually referring to this Greek version, not the Egyptian one. Yet both point back to the same source, a belief that knowledge is sacred, that writing is a divine act, that understanding the universe means understanding the self. Two traditions, two survivals, one buried in sand, one carried by ink, and between them a mystery still unfolding, shaped by time, language, and the quiet hands that dared to preserve them. As Christianity expanded across the Roman Empire in the 1st centuries after Christ, it faced a challenge that was not military, but intellectual. The world it was entering was already full of beliefs, gods, and texts. Among them was Hermes Trismegistus. For early Christian thinkers, Hermes presented a puzzle. On one hand, he was clearly part of a pagan system. On the other, his writings spoke of divine unity, the soul, and the search for truth. He sounded almost like a prophet. So what should be done with him? The answer was never simple. Some Christians rejected him entirely. They saw the Hermetic texts as dangerous, filled with magical thinking and false gods. To them, anything outside the Bible was a threat. But others took a different view. They believed Hermes might have been a pagan who somehow glimpsed parts of the truth before Christ came. This idea, known as Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology, suggested that there had once been a pure, original wisdom given by God. Over time, this wisdom had been distorted, but pieces of it remained in the writings of ancient sages. Hermes was seen as one of them. Writers like Lactantius, a Christian author from the 3rd century, even quoted Hermes in support of Christian ideas. They claimed that Hermes had predicted the coming of a saviour and believed in one supreme God. These claims helped early Christians show that their faith was not new or strange. Instead, it was the fulfillment of ancient wisdom. But this view was risky. If Hermes was treated as a true source of divine insight, then his texts could also challenge church authority. So as Christianity became more powerful, especially after the 4th century, the attitude shifted. The church began to draw sharper lines. Wisdom was allowed only if it supported doctrine. Anything else was labeled heresy. Hermetic texts, which had once been used in debates and sermons, were now viewed with growing suspicion. By the early Middle Ages, most Hermetic works were forgotten in the Latin West. Only a few remained, often in poor translations, stored in monastic libraries, or hidden in private collections. In the Greek-speaking East, the writings survived a little longer, but even there, they were seen as part of a pagan past. Still, the legend of Hermes did not disappear. His name continued to appear in lists of ancient philosophers and magicians. He was remembered as a figure of deep knowledge, even if few had access to what he actually wrote. What began as curiosity slowly turned to caution. By the time the Renaissance arrived, Hermes was a ghost, revered by some, feared by others, a name that stood for both lost wisdom and forbidden thought. Through the Christian lens, Hermes was never just one thing. He was a mirror. For some, he reflected truth. For others, temptation. And in that reflection, we see the struggle between faith and knowledge, belief and curiosity that has shaped history ever since. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, much of Europe entered a period of political instability and cultural decline. Cities crumbled, trade slowed, and access to classical learning became limited. But in the East, something very different was happening. While the West seemed to forget, the East remembered. In the Eastern Mediterranean, especially in places like Alexandria, Antioch, and later Constantinople, Greek learning continued. This region, controlled by the Byzantine Empire, remained a center of scholarship, where ancient texts were copied, studied, and debated. Greek was still spoken. Libraries were still active, and manuscripts, including Hermetic writings, continued to survive. Alexandria in Egypt played a special role. Known for its legendary library, it had long been a crossroads of Egyptian, Greek, and Christian thought. Even after the library's decline, the city remained an intellectual hub. Christian scholars debated philosophy with pagan thinkers. Medical texts were preserved. And although some Hermetic works were banned or lost, others quietly passed from hand to hand. Hermetic texts were written in Greek, and this made them easier to preserve in the East. Many of these writings were stored in private collections or monasteries, where scribes copied them by hand. Over time, they were mixed in with other philosophical works, including writings by Plato, Aristotle, and early Christian thinkers. This created a layered tradition where spiritual and scientific ideas coexisted. In cities like Harran in modern-day Turkey, scholars practiced astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy, often drawing on Hermetic and Neoplatonic sources. These centers became important links in the chain of knowledge, especially as they passed texts into the Islamic world. When the Islamic caliphates expanded in the 7th and 8th centuries, they encountered this preserved Greek knowledge in the East. Rather than destroy it, they translated it. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a famous center for translation, where Greek works were turned into Arabic. This included philosophical, medical, and mathematical texts. And although Hermetic writings were never the main focus, some ideas and fragments were included. Hermeticism, with its focus on the soul, the stars, and the unity of all things, found echoes in certain streams of Islamic thought, especially among early alchemists and mystics. The knowledge preserved in the Eastern Mediterranean eventually made its way back to Western Europe, but not for several centuries. When it did, it came through the Eastern Gate, through Greek copies, Arabic translations, and Jewish commentaries. Without the scholars of the East, much of this material would have vanished completely. What the West called a dark age was not dark everywhere. In the East, light still burned, manuscripts were still being copied, debates still took place. And while the names and languages changed, the core idea remained the same, that wisdom is worth preserving, and sometimes the key to the future lies in what others have chosen to remember. In the early 15th century, Europe began to change. The Renaissance was more than just an artistic revival. It was a rediscovery of ancient knowledge. And at the center of this movement stood a group of scholars known as humanists. They were not just interested in art or language. They were obsessed with books, but not just any books. They wanted the originals, the Greek codices, the lost wisdom of the ancients. And among the names they hunted, one stood out: Hermes Trismegistus. After centuries of decline in the West, much of classical knowledge had been lost or hidden. Latin versions of ancient texts were often poor translations or incomplete summaries. But in the East, especially in the Byzantine Empire, many original Greek manuscripts still survived. As the Ottoman Turks advanced on Constantinople, humanist scholars in Italy saw an opportunity. They sent agents, diplomats, and collectors to find and retrieve these manuscripts before it was too late. Figures like Giovanni Aurispa and Francesco Filelfo brought back hundreds of Greek texts, including works by Plato, Aristotle, and lesser-known authors. It was during this intellectual gold rush that the Hermetica reappeared. A manuscript containing the Corpus Hermeticum was found in Macedonia and brought to Italy around the year 1460. It was handed to Cosimo de' Medici, one of the most powerful patrons of the arts and scholarship in Florence. Cosimo was old and believed he was near death. He told his scholar Marsilio Ficino to stop translating Plato and start with Hermes. In his eyes, Hermes was older, purer, and closer to divine truth. Ficino began to translate the Hermetic texts into Latin. This made them accessible for the first time to a Western audience. The result was a sensation. The writings spoke of one God, of a divine cosmos, of the human soul's ability to ascend. They seemed to confirm Christian ideas while also opening the door to ancient magic, astrology, and philosophy. To Renaissance thinkers, this was not pagan nonsense. This was Prisca Theologia, ancient theology, a vision of wisdom that existed before Moses, before Christ, and that had now been recovered. The return of Hermes was more than just academic. It influenced art, science, and religion. Alchemists studied his writings. Architects designed buildings based on his symbols. Philosophers saw in him a guide for uniting faith and reason. The Hermetic revival helped fuel the idea that humans were divine in origin, capable of shaping their destiny through knowledge. But behind the beauty and insight, there was also a tension. The Church watched closely. Not all Hermetic ideas fit doctrine, and soon questions would rise about how old these texts really were. But in that moment, none of it mattered. After 1,000 years, Hermes had returned to the West. Not as a myth, but as a voice from the ancient world, speaking again through ink and parchment, carried by the hands of those who believed knowledge could be lost, but also found again. In the year 1463, something unusual happened in Florence. Marsilio Ficino, a Catholic priest and scholar deeply involved in translating the works of Plato, was given a new task. His patron, Cosimo de' Medici, had just acquired a Greek manuscript. But it was not from Plato or Aristotle. It was from someone older, someone legendary. The name on the manuscript was Hermes Trismegistus. Cosimo believed that this voice from the ancient world carried truths even older than Moses. And because he was aging and feared he might die soon, he wanted Ficino to put everything else aside and begin translating immediately. Ficino obeyed. What he worked on would become known as the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of spiritual dialogues written in Greek. Ficino translated the texts into Latin. the language most widely read among scholars and clergy in Western Europe at the time. The impact was immediate and powerful. The Hermetic writings spoke of one divine source, of the human soul as a reflection of that source, and of the universe as a living being filled with spirit and order. It was mystical, philosophical, and poetic all at once. To Ficino and others in the Florentine Academy, it felt like the missing link between classical philosophy and Christian belief. Ficino was not just a translator. He was also a theologian who believed that divine truth had been revealed not only through the Bible, but also through a chain of wise men from different cultures. He placed Hermes at the start of that chain. This idea, called ancient theology, suggested that the best parts of pagan wisdom were actually glimpses of God's truth, scattered before the arrival of Christ. Ficino believed Hermes had written thousands of years before the Greeks, and that his teachings had survived underground, waiting for the right moment to return. That belief gave the texts incredible authority. Renaissance thinkers began to study them with the same seriousness as Scripture. The Hermetic revival spread beyond Florence. Artists used its symbols. Scientists drew inspiration from its vision of a connected universe. Alchemists found support for their spiritual experiments. Philosophers argued that the human soul could ascend toward divine understanding through contemplation and knowledge. All of this started with Ficino's translation. But there was a problem. The dating of the texts was based on faith and tradition, not solid evidence. Later scholars would show that the Corpus Hermeticum was not written in ancient Egypt, but during the early centuries after Christ. Still, the influence of the translation could not be undone. Ficino's work gave Hermes a voice in the modern world, a voice that sounded both ancient and strangely familiar, a voice that spoke not just of gods and stars, but of the human longing to understand where we come from and what lies beyond. By bringing Hermes into Latin, Ficino did more than translate a text. He helped launch a new way of thinking, one that saw wisdom as something hidden, scattered, and waiting to be remembered. In the year 1475, something quietly monumental took place inside the walls of Rome. Under the direction of Pope Sixtus IV, the Vatican Library was formally established. It was not just a building, it was a declaration, a signal that the Church was not only the guardian of faith, but now the guardian of memory. For centuries, religious orders had copied and preserved texts in monasteries, but there was no central location, no official archive. The knowledge of the ancient world had been scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean, often lost, damaged, or hidden. With the rise of humanism and the rediscovery of Greek texts, the Church saw the need to respond. The Vatican Library was created to gather these works under one roof. Its early collection included religious manuscripts, classical writings, and new translations flowing in from the East. At the time of its founding, the library already held over 2,000 manuscripts. That number would grow rapidly. The goal was not only to preserve sacred texts, but also to contain the intellectual revival that was sweeping Europe. Rome wanted to shape how knowledge was remembered, and it did so by building a memory palace. The term memory palace refers to a method of storing ideas through mental architecture. But the Vatican did this physically. Marble halls, carefully catalogued shelves, scribes and scholars working in silence. The building was designed to show reverence, not just for Scripture, but for the act of preserving history itself. The Vatican Library became a place where texts were not only stored, but studied. It attracted some of the finest minds of the Renaissance, many of whom were engaged in translating ancient works from Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic into Latin. Some of these works had been saved from oblivion by Islamic scholars centuries earlier. Now they were returning to Europe, and Rome made sure they passed through its hands. This control was both protective and selective. The Church wanted to preserve knowledge, but also to filter it. Texts that aligned with Christian doctrine were embraced. Others were set aside, sealed, or kept from public view. The Index of Forbidden Books would come later, but already the idea was clear. The Church would decide what could be remembered and what would be forgotten. Inside the Vatican Library, the past was no longer lost. It was curated. The building itself became a symbol of power. Not the power of armies or kings, but the power of information. Whoever held the books could shape the minds of the future. And for the next 5 centuries, the Vatican would do just that. Today, many imagine the library as a place of secrets and hidden vaults. But its origins were simple. It began as a way to protect what remained of a shattered intellectual world, a place where scrolls and codices could rest, and where history, carefully chosen and preserved, would be passed on to generations who might never know what had once been left out. During the Renaissance, a powerful idea took hold among scholars and theologians across Europe. It was called Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology. This concept claimed that long before Christianity, long before even the prophets of Israel, there had been a pure and original wisdom, a divine truth revealed by God to the earliest humans. According to this view, fragments of that wisdom had been preserved across different cultures in different forms. And one of the most important keepers of that wisdom was believed to be Hermes Trismegistos. For thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Hermes was not just an old myth. He was a prophet of the highest order. They placed him in the same lineage as Moses and Zoroaster. Some even believed he lived during the time of the biblical flood. The Hermetic texts, especially the ones Ficino translated, seemed to support this idea. They spoke of one supreme God. They described the human soul as divine and eternal. They promoted a vision of the universe that echoed Christian teachings, but in a language that felt older, deeper, and more mystical. This alignment made Renaissance scholars believe they were witnessing the echoes of a truth that had always existed. Egyptian wisdom, seen through the figure of Hermes, became a kind of shadowy prelude to Christian revelation. It was as if the ancient world had been trying to say something all along, and now the message was finally being understood. The promise of Prisca Theologia gave legitimacy to the study of non-Christian texts. It allowed Renaissance thinkers to explore magic, astrology, and Neoplatonic philosophy without feeling they were betraying their faith. If these things were rooted in primordial wisdom, then they could be seen as part of God's plan. Hermes was not seen as a rival to Christ, but as a distant forerunner, a voice calling out from Egypt, pointing toward truths that would later be fulfilled in the gospel. This blending of traditions created a unique intellectual climate. In art, Hermes appeared alongside saints. In philosophy, Hermetic ideas influenced debates about the soul and the cosmos. Even in science, the belief in a unified living universe shaped how people studied nature. But this harmony was built on a misunderstanding. Scholars believed the Hermetic texts were thousands of years old. In reality, they were written during the early centuries of the Roman Empire. The ideas they carried were still powerful, but they were not as ancient as people thought. Even so, the influence of Prisca Theologia lasted for generations. It gave birth to new systems of thought, encouraged the study of ancient languages, and opened doors to knowledge that had been closed for centuries. It also set the stage for future tensions between faith and reason, authority and curiosity. In the figure of Hermes, the Renaissance found more than a name. It found a symbol of lost wisdom, of bridges between worlds, and of a time when all truth was still one. By the late 15th century, Europe was flooded with manuscripts. Some were philosophical, others medical or scientific. But alongside these came a different category of texts, books on alchemy, astrology, and ritual practice. They claimed to unlock hidden forces of nature. Some linked themselves directly to ancient sources, like Hermes Trismegistus. And with their spread came a serious problem, a magic problem. The Church now had to decide which kinds of knowledge were acceptable, and which crossed the line into heresy. Alchemy, for example, was often framed as a natural science. It explored how metals could change, how matter behaved, and even how the soul could be purified. Many alchemists were devout Christians. They saw their work as symbolic, not just physical. Turning lead into gold represented turning the human heart toward God. But the language of alchemy was obscure and full of coded symbols. This secrecy made it easy to misunderstand. Some viewed it as deception, others as dangerous. Astrology created even more tension. It had been practiced since ancient times and was widely used to predict the movements of stars and planets. Many believed these movements influenced human behavior, even fate. Courts hired astrologers. Physicians consulted star charts. But church leaders worried. If the stars controlled life, where was human free will? Where was divine grace? The tension boiled over when people began to mix these systems with ritual. Handbooks appeared claiming to summon spirits, unlock hidden knowledge, or influence others through spoken words and sacred symbols. Some drew on Jewish mysticism. Others borrowed from Arabic magic or pagan rites. These books were often copied in secret, and their connection to names like Hermes, Solomon, and even Moses gave them an air of legitimacy. But the Church saw danger. Magic blurred boundaries. It looked like religion, but lacked divine authority. It used symbols like crosses, prayers, and Latin words, but outside the control of priests. This was especially threatening in a world where spiritual power was tightly regulated. If anyone could access hidden forces through books, what role did the Church have as the gatekeeper of salvation? As a result, Church authorities began drawing clear lines. They approved the study of nature, medicine, and philosophy as long as they followed accepted frameworks. But texts that promised power without grace were condemned. Some were banned, others were burned. Thinkers like Pico della Mirandola tried to defend certain mystical practices as part of Prisca Theologia. He argued that ancient wisdom could deepen Christian faith. But the line was hard to hold. Inquisitors often treated all magical texts as suspect, regardless of intention. Over time, even works once praised by scholars were reclassified as dangerous. The same manuscript that one generation viewed as sacred might be labeled demonic by the next. The magic problem was never just about content. It was about control. Who had the right to interpret knowledge? Who could speak for the divine? And who could decide what counted as truth? As books multiplied, those questions only grew louder, and the Church was determined to answer them. In the year 1559, the Catholic Church made a decision that would shape the boundaries of knowledge for centuries. It published the first official Index Librorum Prohibitorum, known simply as the Index of Forbidden Books. This was not just a list. It was a wall, a clear boundary drawn between what the Church approved and what it condemned. At first, the index was a response to the printing press. Invention had made books cheaper, faster, and easier to spread. Suddenly, ideas could move across countries in weeks instead of years. This terrified religious authorities. With the rise of Protestant reformers, heretical doctrines were appearing in print. The Church needed a way to protect the faithful. The index was their answer. It named specific authors and titles that Catholics were forbidden to read. But the scope quickly expanded. It was not just about stopping Protestant theology. The index also targeted scientific theories, political ideas, and especially works related to astrology, alchemy, and Hermetic thought. Some of the same texts that had fueled the Renaissance were now labelled dangerous. Even thinkers who had once been respected found themselves blacklisted. Books by Galileo, Giordano Bruno, and Cornelius Agrippa were added. Many Hermetic and magical texts were condemned outright, especially those dealing with divination or summoning spirits. The Church saw these not as harmless curiosities, but as spiritual threats. They claimed to offer power outside the sacraments. Knowledge without obedience. The message was clear. Reading the wrong book could endanger your soul. For Catholic scholars, this created a climate of fear and caution. Libraries had to check their holdings. Publishers were required to seek church approval. In some cases, books were allowed only if key sections were removed or rewritten. This process was called expurgation. But even then, the damage was done. Ideas labelled forbidden often vanished from academic debate. The index was not static. It changed over time. New editions were published by different popes. Some books were removed, others were added. But the core idea remained the same. The Church would decide what truth looked like in print. It was a form of censorship that lasted far longer than many realize. Even as Enlightenment thinkers pushed back in the 17th and 18th centuries, the index stayed active. It was not until the year 1966, during the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, that the index was officially abolished. By then, the world had changed. Modern education, freedom of the press, and global communication had made the list feel outdated. But its legacy remains. For over 400 years, the index shaped what people could read, think, and even believe. It served as a tool of control, but also as a reminder that ideas have power, that books are not neutral, and that behind every list of forbidden titles lies a deeper story about who gets to define truth and who is told to stay silent. In the year 1614, a single scholarly argument shook the foundation of centuries of belief. The man behind it was Isaac Casaubon, a Swiss-born classical scholar working in England. His target was not a political system or a religious doctrine. It was a timeline. Specifically, the belief that the Hermetic writings were as ancient as the pyramids of Egypt. For over 100 years, European thinkers had treated Hermes Trismegistus as a source of primeval wisdom. The Hermetic texts had been placed at the beginning of human history, seen as sacred messages from the dawn of time. Philosophers, priests, and mystics believed they contained truths given to humanity before the coming of Moses. This belief supported the idea of Prisca Theologia, the theory that all real knowledge came from one original source. But Casaubon saw a problem. He had studied ancient Greek literature for years and had mastered the tools of philology, the close analysis of language. When he examined the Corpus Hermeticum, he did not just read it, he dissected it. He looked at the grammar, the vocabulary, and the structure of the texts. What he found did not match the claims made by Renaissance scholars. The style of Greek used in the Hermetic texts was not from ancient Egypt. It belonged to the period of late antiquity, specifically between the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ. Casaubon argued that the writings were not the voice of an ancient Egyptian sage, but the product of a later era, influenced by Christian, Jewish, and Greek philosophical thought. The texts were spiritual and profound, but they were not as old as people believed. This conclusion hit the Renaissance worldview hard. If Hermes was not ancient, then the foundation of Prisca Theologia was weakened. The dream of an unbroken chain of divine wisdom stretching back to the earliest humans no longer held up. What had seemed like prophecy now looked like philosophy dressed in myth. Some scholars resisted, others ignored the findings. But over time, Casaubon's analysis gained ground. It marked a shift from mystical reverence to historical critique. The Hermetica were still read, but now as cultural artifacts rather than sacred texts. Casaubon had not intended to destroy Hermes. He respected the writings for their spiritual depth. But he believed truth mattered more than tradition. His work signaled the rise of a new kind of scholarship, one that valued evidence over legend and language over myth. It was part of a larger movement toward critical history, the same movement that would later challenge traditional views of scripture, science, and society. What Casaubon broke was not the value of the Hermetica, but the illusion of their age. By doing so, he forced Europe to rethink where knowledge comes from and how the past should be measured. In the quiet work of reading ancient words, Casaubon had changed the way the Western world understood its own intellectual inheritance. In the year 1612, Pope Paul V issued a decree that changed the way the Vatican handled information. It did not involve new doctrine or spiritual reform. It was about documents. Specifically, how church records should be gathered, stored, and controlled. Until this point, important records of the Catholic Church were often scattered across different offices, dioceses, and religious orders. There was no single system. Letters, decrees, financial logs, and court proceedings were kept in various locations, sometimes poorly preserved or completely lost. What Pope Paul did was simple but powerful. He ordered that all significant church paperwork be centralized in one place. This move created a more unified archive under the direct authority of the Vatican. It was the beginning of what would later be known as the Vatican Apostolic Archive. At the time, it was not seen as mysterious or secretive. It was administrative. But, in practice, this act gave the Church a new kind of power. Paperwork became a tool for shaping history. With a centralized archive, the Vatican could now control how the past was remembered. It could track decisions, trace communications, and enforce internal discipline with greater precision. Church authorities gained the ability to study older documents when needed, while keeping others out of public view. Over time, the size of this archive grew. It included everything from papal bulls to reports from missionaries across the world. It held political correspondence with kings and emperors, internal memos, theological debates, and disciplinary records. Some materials were centuries old, others arrived daily. By creating a controlled environment for these documents, the Vatican developed one of the most sophisticated archival systems in the world. The decision also had cultural consequences. As access to the records became restricted, rumors began to spread. Outsiders imagined hidden texts, lost gospels, and ancient maps locked away in underground chambers. The image of the Vatican as a place of secrets began to take shape. People wondered what was being kept from public view. Were there writings from early Christianity that contradicted official teaching? Were there books of magic or science never meant to be seen? The truth was more bureaucratic than mystical. But that did not stop the speculation. The aura of secrecy only deepened over the centuries, especially as the Vatican became more powerful. Scholars, historians, and journalists sometimes waited years to gain access to specific documents. Some were denied entirely. The Church insisted this was to protect the integrity of its records. Critics said it was about control. Either way, the result was clear. Centralizing paperwork gave the Vatican a lasting influence, not only over faith, but over knowledge itself. The pen had always been mightier than the sword, but now the file cabinet had become mightier than both. And behind locked doors in the heart of Rome, history was being written, preserved, and in some cases quietly hidden from view. In the Latin language, the word secretum does not mean secret in the way most people understand it today. It means private. When the Vatican used the term Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, it was never meant to suggest conspiracy or hidden knowledge. It simply referred to the Pope's personal archive, a collection of documents under his direct control, separate from public or general church records. But as time passed and languages changed, the word secretum began to sound more mysterious. In English and other modern languages, the word secret carries a heavy meaning. It suggests something deliberately hidden, something not meant to be known. This created confusion that would shape the way people imagined the Vatican's archive for centuries. The Vatican never intended for its archive to become the focus of global curiosity. Yet, that is exactly what happened. As stories about forbidden books and ancient manuscripts spread, the public began to see the archive as a vault of secrets. They imagined lost gospels, magical texts, or even records of contact with angels and other worldly beings. Popular novels, films, and television shows turned the archive into a place of suspense and shadow. But inside the Vatican, archivists had a very different view. To them, it was an organized system of paperwork, not a treasure chest of mysteries, but a tool for managing the memory of the Church. The archive contains centuries of letters, legal documents, diplomatic reports, and administrative records. Some of it is sensitive, some of it is mundane. Over time, Vatican officials realized the word secretum was creating unnecessary drama. So in the year 2019, Pope Francis approved a change. The archive was renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archive. This move was meant to clarify that the word secret had been misunderstood. The Church wanted people to know it was not hiding magic or mystery. It was managing history. Even so, the original name had already done its work. The phrase Vatican Secret Archive had lived in the public imagination for too long. It had become a symbol, a reminder that there are places in the world where access to knowledge is limited, where history is filtered, and where some documents may never be seen by the outside world. The truth is that secretum means private. But privacy in the hands of powerful institutions will always raise questions. What is being protected? Who decides what can be shared? And why do some records remain sealed for generations? These questions are not just about the Church. They touch every system that stores knowledge, from governments to corporations. But the Vatican, with its long history and spiritual authority, carries special weight. Its archives hold not only information, but the imagination of millions. And while secretum may mean private, the boundary between privacy and secrecy remains thin, especially when the past is at stake, and the keys to the archive are held by only a few. Somewhere between fact and fiction, the idea of a single lost book of Thoth began to take shape. It was not discovered in a tomb or preserved in a monastery. It was imagined. Western esoteric culture, over time, blended fragments of ancient Egyptian tradition with Renaissance Hermeticism, and created a mythic object that never truly existed. The Egyptians did believe in sacred writings associated with Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and magic. He was said to have authored countless scrolls containing cosmic secrets, rituals, and knowledge of the gods. Some of these were kept in the so-called House of Life, temple libraries, where scribes preserved religious and magical texts. But these were many documents, not one. They were practical, symbolic, and often limited to specific ritual contexts. Centuries later, the Greeks who settled in Egypt during the Ptolemaic period identified Thoth with their own god Hermes. This fusion gave rise to Hermes Trismegistus, the supposed author of a spiritual tradition blending Egyptian imagery with Greek philosophy. Out of that tradition came the Hermetica, a collection of mystical dialogues written in Greek between the 1st and 3rd centuries after Christ. But again, these were many texts, not a single volume. As these traditions merged and moved through time, Western thinkers began to imagine something more, especially in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, when secrecy, magic, and forbidden knowledge held a strange appeal. The idea of one master book that contained all of Thoth's teachings began to appear in occult writings, grimoires, and whispered legends. By the 17th and 18th centuries, this so-called Lost Book of Thoth became a symbol, often linked to tarot cards, alchemy, and secret societies. Writers claimed it held the key to understanding the universe, to summoning spirits, or to unlocking human potential. But no one ever found it, because it never existed. It was a construction of longing, a fusion of mystery and prestige. The name Thoth gave the legend an ancient Egyptian glow. The link to Hermes gave it philosophical credibility. Together, they created the perfect symbol of forbidden wisdom. This imaginary book became a placeholder for everything Western esotericism could not explain or prove. It stood for what had been erased, censored, or forgotten. It allowed believers to say the knowledge had once existed, but was stolen or hidden. It also allowed writers and occultists to create new works under its name. Some even claimed to receive visions or channel its contents through dreams or rituals. The Lost Book of Thoth, then, was less a historical artifact and more a mirror. It reflected what each generation hoped or feared about ancient wisdom. It was used to question authority, to explore spirituality, and to connect with a past that always seemed just out of reach. And while no archaeologist ever uncovered a single book of Thoth, the idea continued to live in culture, in literature, and in imagination. Not because it was real, but because people needed it to be. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Western world became obsessed with ancient Egypt. This cultural wave, often called Egyptomania, followed major archaeological discoveries, museum exhibitions, and sensational headlines. The deciphering of hieroglyphs by Jean-François Champollion in the early 1820s had opened the door to a forgotten world. Soon after, European travelers, scholars, and collectors poured into Egypt, digging up tombs, gathering relics, and shipping monuments back to cities like Paris and London. But this fascination was not only about history, it was also about imagination. The image of Egypt that emerged in popular culture was full of mystery, magic, and lost wisdom. Temples became portals to the unknown. Hieroglyphs became codes waiting to be cracked. And at the center of it all stood Thoth. No longer just an Egyptian deity, Thoth became a symbol. His name appeared in novels, secret society rituals, tarot decks, and magical handbooks. Occult writers described him as the keeper of sacred knowledge, the scribe of the gods, and the guardian of spiritual transformation. The more mysterious Egypt seemed, the more powerful the myth of Thoth became. Secret societies like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn used Egyptian symbols to structure their rituals. They claimed to draw from ancient wisdom, even if their sources were mostly European books and imagination. The blending of Thoth with Hermes Trismegistus gave these rituals an air of timeless authority. It suggested that modern initiates were tapping into a lineage that stretched back thousands of years. Publishers joined the trend. Books with Egyptian imagery sold well, especially when paired with claims of hidden knowledge. Alchemical diagrams were redrawn with pyramids in the background. Tarot decks, like the famous Thoth Tarot, designed by Aleister Crowley and artist Frieda Harris in the 1930s, linked each card to Egyptian gods and Hermetic ideas. Crowley described Thoth as a figure of cosmic intelligence, a being who guided the initiate through levels of spiritual awakening. For many readers, it did not matter whether these ideas were historically accurate. What mattered was the feeling of depth, of reaching beyond ordinary reality. Thoth was no longer just a character in old myths. He had become a cultural code for mystery itself. Egyptomania gave this code its visual power. Obelisks, scarabs, and ankhs appeared in architecture, jewelry, and even graveyards. Movies and novels featured curses, mummies, and ancient scrolls. Egypt became a stage where the unknown could still be explored, and Thoth was cast in the role of the wise magician, always hidden just out of sight. The result was a feedback loop. The more people imagined Thoth as the key to secret knowledge, the more they saw him reflected in everything mysterious. And the more they saw him, the more real he seemed. Egyptomania did not rediscover Thoth. It reinvented him. It turned him into a symbol that could mean anything, a tool for occult teachings, a brand for esoteric books, a shadow that still lingers behind the curtain of ancient history. While pop culture imagined a mythical lost book of Thoth, real scholars quietly uncovered something different, but even more fascinating. Egyptologists working through the 20th and 21st centuries began to identify actual Egyptian texts that fit the ancient descriptions of Thoth's teachings. These were not fantasy manuscripts hidden in secret vaults. They were real papyri, written in the Demotic script and dating from the Greco-Roman period of Egyptian history. The texts are scattered across dozens of papyrus fragments held in museums and collections around the world. Together, they are now known by scholars as the Demotic Book of Thoth. Unlike the Hermetic writings that were composed in Greek and blended with Greek philosophy, These texts were written by Egyptian temple scribes, most likely between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after. They reflect a very different worldview, one rooted in native Egyptian tradition rather than Hellenistic synthesis. The content of the Book of Thoth is dense and symbolic. It takes the form of dialogues between a master and a disciple. The master is often identified with Thoth himself, or with a figure speaking in his voice. The student listens, asks questions, and receives teachings on ritual knowledge, sacred writing, cosmology, and initiation. There are references to temple practices, magical formulas, and the responsibilities of the scribal class. What makes these texts unique is how they blend spiritual, intellectual, and ritual instruction. They are not just about how to write or how to read the stars. They are about how to transform the soul through knowledge. In this way, they resemble the later Hermetic writings, but they are older and closer to the Egyptian priestly tradition. The fact that they were written in Demotic is key. Demotic was the everyday script of Egypt at the time, used for legal, religious, and literary texts. It was less formal than hieroglyphs, but still deeply tied to temple culture. For a long time, these papyri were difficult to translate and understand. Their language is obscure, their symbols complex, and many fragments are damaged or incomplete. But over the past few decades, a clearer picture has emerged. Scholars now believe the Book of Thoth was a real instructional text, used by scribes and priests who served in temples during the last centuries of native Egyptian religion. It is not a single book, but a loose collection of writings passed down through copying and commentary. The discovery of these texts changes the story. It shows that the ancient Egyptians did have a written tradition tied to Thoth that taught spiritual and ritual knowledge. It was not lost. It was just buried in archives, waiting to be read by those who could understand the script. The Demotic Book of Thoth is not the fantasy of a magical superbook. It is something more grounded and more human. A window into how real people in ancient Egypt understood the divine, their duties, and the mysterious role of knowledge in transforming the self. The Demotic Book of Thoth, as it is now understood by scholars, is not a spellbook filled with dramatic rituals or magical explosions. It doesn't teach how to summon gods or unlock the universe with a single chant. What it offers instead is far more grounded and historically important. The text reads like a temple manual. It is a structured dialogue between a master and a disciple, often set in a sacred space. The language is symbolic, poetic, and sometimes deliberately obscure. But its purpose is clear. It is about the transmission of sacred knowledge from teacher to student. The master figure, speaking in the voice of Thoth, or as a priest in his service, explains the responsibilities of being a scribe. In ancient Egypt, scribes were not just writers. They were cultural and spiritual elites, trained in temple law, ritual procedure, astronomical calculation, and moral philosophy. The Book of Thoth trains the student not only in the mechanical skills of writing, but in how to think and live as a person of wisdom. The conversations in the text touch on the nature of divine order, the function of ritual speech, and the relationship between writing and the cosmos. There are reflections on silence, listening, and how sacred knowledge should be handled with care. The scribe is taught to see their tools not just as instruments, but as extensions of divine will. The reed pen becomes a bridge between heaven and earth. The scroll becomes a vessel of spirit. These themes reflect the core values of Egyptian temple culture, during the late periods of its history. By the time these texts were written, Egypt had already gone through waves of foreign rule, including Persian, Greek, and Roman control. Temples were no longer just religious centers. They were also cultural fortresses, preserving identity through teaching and ritual. The Book of Thoth fits into this environment. It was not written for the public. It was not even meant for all priests. It was likely reserved for an inner circle of advanced scribes who were being prepared to take on major responsibilities. The text reminds the student that knowledge is dangerous if handled without discipline. True initiation comes through study, obedience, and moral clarity. What surprises many readers is how philosophical the text feels. It is not about casting spells or bending nature. It is about how to become someone worthy of speaking truth. This emphasis on ethical formation connects the Book of Thoth to the later Hermetic writings, which also stress inner transformation through wisdom. But unlike the Hermetica, the Book of Thoth remains rooted in the temple world of ancient Egypt. It carries the tone of a priestly classroom, not a mystical vision. The real Book of Thoth is not lost. It is not magical in the way movies suggest. But it is powerful in a different sense. It shows how the ancient Egyptians used writing not just to record facts, but to shape souls. It teaches that sacred learning is not something you take. It is something you earn. The real fragments of the demotic Book of Thoth do not sit in a secret vault beneath the Vatican. They are not locked away in a forbidden chamber or guarded by shadowy figures. In fact, the most important pieces of this ancient text are housed in public and academic collections across Europe and beyond. Scholars know exactly where most of them are, and they have been studied for decades. One of the most important collections is in Berlin. The Egyptian Museum and Papyrus Collection of the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin holds a significant number of demotic papyri, including key fragments of the Book of Thoth. These documents were acquired during archaeological expeditions and excavations in Egypt, particularly from temple sites like Tebtunis and Hermopolis, where priestly activity continued well into the Greco-Roman era. In these cities, scribes maintained traditions that had evolved for over 1,000 years. The papyri reflect this continuity, with layers of Egyptian thought still visible beneath the Greek influence of the time. Other major fragments of the Book of Thoth are held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, the British Museum in London, and the University of Michigan in the United States. These collections were built through a mix of colonial-era excavations, purchases from private collectors, and academic missions during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of the texts are fragile, written in black ink on papyrus sheets that have been carefully restored and preserved. Some are stored in climate-controlled rooms. Others are available to researchers through digital archives and scholarly publications. What all these collections have in common is that they are not hidden. They are part of museum holdings or academic libraries, often with open access for qualified researchers. While not everything has been translated or fully understood, the idea that the Book of Thoth is locked away in Vatican secrecy is a myth. The Vatican Apostolic Archive does contain vast amounts of material related to church history, but it is not the primary source for ancient Egyptian religious texts. Its collections are focused on papal correspondence, theological writings, and ecclesiastical documents from the last 2,000 years of Catholic history. That does not mean the Vatican has no Egyptian material at all. Like many institutions, it holds some ancient artifacts. But when it comes to the demotic Book of Thoth, the most relevant manuscripts are found elsewhere. The belief that the Vatican controls all forbidden knowledge is a powerful image. It feeds into popular theories of suppression, secret wisdom, and religious control. But the real story is more academic. It is about museums, universities, and the slow, careful work of piecing together ancient fragments. The Demotic Book of Thoth is not locked away. It lives in the hands of scholars, on the pages of research journals, and in collections that anyone with patience and curiosity can explore. The mystery is not in the location. It is in the language, the symbols, and the ancient voices still waiting to be fully understood. The Vatican Library does not house the original Egyptian Book of Thoth, but what it does contain is no less important. Its collections are among the richest in the world for understanding how Hermetic and related esoteric texts were preserved, copied, and interpreted in Christian Europe. Founded formally in the year 1475, the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana was envisioned as a central repository of knowledge under direct papal authority. Over the centuries, it gathered thousands of manuscripts, many of them priceless. Some arrived through diplomatic gifts, others were acquired from dissolved monasteries or private collectors. Among these manuscripts are numerous works connected to the Hermetic tradition. Not Egyptian originals, but medieval and Renaissance Latin and Greek copies of Hermetic texts. These include versions of the Corpus Hermeticum, the foundational set of philosophical dialogues attributed to Hermes, Trismegistus. Many of these texts were translated during the Renaissance, especially in Florence, under the patronage of the Medici family. Once translated into Latin by figures like Marsilio Ficino, they circulated through educated circles and eventually reached ecclesiastical scholars in Rome. The Vatican Library played a major role in preserving these versions. They were copied by hand, annotated by theologians, and discussed alongside early Christian writings. Hermetic texts were often treated not as dangerous magic, but as sources of ancient wisdom that could be harmonized with Christian thought. This was especially true during the Renaissance, when many church thinkers believed in a concept called prisca theologia, the idea that all religions contained echoes of a single divine truth revealed at the beginning of time. Hermes Trismegistus, as the supposed author of the Hermetica, was seen as a possible prophet of this original theology. His writings were compared to those of Plato, Moses, and even early church fathers. The Vatican's role in collecting and safeguarding these materials helped shape how they were read and understood. It also influenced which texts were allowed into theological debate and which were left out. Some Hermetic ideas were welcomed. Others, especially those leaning toward alchemy or astrology, were met with suspicion. Beyond the Hermetica, the Vatican Library also holds works by figures influenced by Hermetic thought. These include writings by medieval alchemists, Renaissance philosophers, and early scientists who blurred the line between theology and natural magic. The manuscripts are often illuminated, marked with marginal notes, and sometimes indexed according to subjects that reveal how they were classified by church scholars. While the library is not a secretive dungeon of forbidden scrolls, it is highly selective about access. Scholars must apply for permission, and only a limited number of visitors are allowed at a time. This has helped preserve the materials, but also contributed to the aura of secrecy that surrounds the Vatican's manuscript collections. In truth, what the Vatican holds is not hidden wisdom from ancient Egypt. It is the record of how European Christianity received, filtered, and reinterpreted ideas that once came from far older civilizations. The story of Thoth within the Vatican is not about possession, it is about interpretation. The idea that ancient truths are being hidden in locked rooms is one of the most powerful and lasting narratives in Western culture. It shows up in books, films, documentaries, and conspiracy theories. And one of the most common targets is the Vatican. But much of this mystique comes not from what the Vatican actually hides, but from how it grants access. Like many major archives, the Vatican Apostolic Archive follows strict rules. These rules are designed to protect fragile materials, to ensure serious research, and to preserve the legacy of the Church. Scholars who want to access documents must apply in advance, provide academic credentials, and explain the purpose of their research. Only those engaged in historical or textual scholarship are admitted. No cameras, no phones, and no random browsing. Visitors must know exactly what they are looking for and request specific documents. These rules are not unique to the Vatican. Many state and academic archives across the world use similar procedures. But because of the religious power and long history of the Vatican, the same process feels different. It feels like something is being kept away from the public. This sense of restricted access feeds the myth of hidden knowledge, especially when people imagine the Church as an institution that might want to control information. Over time, this has led to the belief that the Vatican is hiding ancient texts that could change history, rewrite the Bible, or expose lost civilizations. In reality, most of the material inside the archive has to do with church administration. Letters between popes and kings, records of theological debates, or reports from missionaries. It is not that the contents are secret. It is that they are complex, fragile, and often written in Latin or other old languages. Access is controlled to avoid damage, misinterpretation, or sensationalism. But these very limitations become the soil where legends grow. If only a few people can read a text, then its meaning becomes mysterious. If cameras are not allowed, then no one can prove what they saw. And if no one understands the language, then anyone can make up a translation. Myth-making begins at the edge of access. Once a boundary is drawn, people begin to ask what lies beyond it. The less they know, the more they imagine. Some assume that the Church is hiding magical texts. Others believe there are books about Jesus that were removed from the Bible. Still others think there are maps, relics, or ancient technology buried in the archive. None of this has been proven, but the myths continue. The same pattern applies to other institutions. The British Museum, the Library of Alexandria, and even classified government archives all carry the same aura when access is limited. But the Vatican remains the most famous example. Its religious role makes its silence feel intentional. Its history makes its control feel absolute. And its rules, designed to protect history, are often mistaken for a plan to hide it. In truth, the gap between access and imagination is where all legends begin. By the time we reach the modern era, the figure of Thoth no longer lives in one world. He lives in two. One is based on real history, shaped by archaeology, ancient texts, and scholarly research. The other is a story built from myth, imagination, and spiritual longing. The first Thoth belongs to Egypt. He is a god of wisdom, writing, and divine order. His presence is seen in hieroglyphs, temple walls, and papyrus scrolls. In the Greco-Roman period, scribes wrote dialogues that echoed his voice in demotic script. These writings formed what scholars now call the Book of Thoth. It is not a single book, but a collection of priestly teachings, structured as conversations between a master and a student. These texts are rich in symbolism, but grounded in temple life. They train scribes in the moral, ritual, and intellectual duties of their role. They speak of silence, precision, and sacred responsibility. This tradition is real. It has been studied, translated, and pieced together from fragments found in museums around the world. The second Thoth is something else entirely. This version did not come from Egyptian temples, but from Western imaginations. Over centuries, especially in the Renaissance and Romantic periods, the name Thoth was blended with Hermes Trismegistus. He became a symbol of lost wisdom, a bridge between Egypt and Greece, and the supposed author of secret knowledge. This image was shaped by Hermetic philosophy, occult writings, and secret societies. It was fed by Egyptomania, the mystery of ancient ruins, and the allure of forbidden books. In this second story, the Book of Thoth becomes a single powerful volume, a master text that was hidden or stolen, perhaps even locked away in the Vatican. It is said to hold magical formulas, universal truths, or cosmic codes, but no one can find it. That is because it does not exist. It is a symbol, not a scroll, a mirror of what people want to believe about ancient knowledge. These two Thoths now live side by side, one in academic papers, the other in movies and esoteric teachings. One is reconstructed through hard evidence. The other is imagined through stories. They are not enemies, but they are not the same. The danger comes when people confuse the two, when they read a real demotic text and expect it to reveal secret spells, or when they use myths to dismiss genuine research. But both versions say something about how humans seek meaning. The historical Thoth shows how knowledge was preserved, taught, and respected. The mythic Thoth shows how deeply we crave mystery, how we turn absence into a message, and how we imagine what we cannot explain. Two Thoths, one born of ink and ritual, the other born of dream and desire. They are not fighting, they are reflecting each other. And in that reflection, we can see both the limits of history and the power of myth. The real story of Thoth is not a lost book, a secret vault, or a magical conspiracy. It is the story of how texts move, how they are copied by hand, translated into new languages, interpreted by new minds, and passed across centuries. It is a quiet kind of drama, but one that shaped the world. In ancient Egypt, Thoth was a god of writing and wisdom. His teachings were recorded in temple libraries, known as the House of Life. These writings were not just spells or rituals. They were reflections on the role of the scribe, the meaning of words, and the connection between speech and the cosmos. Over time, these teachings evolved. They were written in Demotic, the common script of late Egyptian culture. They became part of a living priestly tradition. But when Greek influence spread into Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, everything changed. Thoth was identified with Hermes. This fusion created Hermes Trismegistus, a figure who became the center of a new body of writings in Greek. These Hermetic texts were different. They mixed Egyptian symbols with Greek philosophy. They talked about divine light, cosmic ascent, and inner rebirth. During the Renaissance, these Greek writings were rediscovered. Marsilio Ficino translated them into Latin in the year 1463. Scholars believed they were older than Moses. They thought they were the original wisdom of the world. This belief gave Hermes a powerful role in Christian Europe. He became a bridge between ancient truth and modern faith. The Vatican Library preserved these translations. Philosophers studied them. Artists painted them. Mystics used them in secret rituals. Over time, the name Thoth became something more than a god. It became a code, a name whispered when talking about forbidden books, ancient power, and hidden truth. But the real process was never about secrets. It was about transmission. Each generation copied what it valued, translated what it could, and reinterpreted what it needed. Some texts were lost, others were changed. Every step in this process shaped the meaning of Thoth. Even the myth of the Lost Book is part of that transmission. It reflects a longing for something whole, something untouched. But real history is messy. It is fragments of papyri in Berlin. It is Latin manuscripts in Rome. It is scholarly debates about what a phrase meant in a dying language. And yet, out of that mess, a legend was born. Not because someone planned it, but because human minds connect symbols. Thoth became the name we give to the wisdom, just out of reach. He is the symbol of how knowledge survives, even when everything else falls. Not by magic, but by memory. The truth behind the thriller is not a single book hidden in a vault. It is a network of scribes, monks, scholars, and seekers. It is a chain of hands passing knowledge forward, sometimes by mistake, sometimes with care. Thoth is not missing. He is everywhere we have carried him, through ink into story, from scroll to screen.